Under the bridge, on the frozen ground, she lay trembling from the cold and pain. Her gaze, full of despair, wandered through the darkness as her strength faded away. And just when everything seemed lost, footsteps echoed. Footsteps of someone who could change her fate. But can she trust again? Her name was Greta. Not long ago, she had lived in a warm, cozy home with her owner, an elderly man named Mikhail. He was lonely. Once he had a family, a wife and 2 children, but the years passed, and his loved ones drifted away. His children moved to another city and rarely visited, and his wife left him, saying she couldn't bear the silence and solitude anymore. Mikhail was left completely alone in a large, empty house. The only one who brought him joy and warmth was Greta. Mikhail called her his faithful companion. They were inseparable. Greta would watch him wherever he went, and in the evenings they would sit together by the fireplace. She could sense his pain and loneliness, comforting him with her presence, while he cared for her as if she were his child. Greta had known only love and was certain their happiness would last forever. But one morning, everything changed. Mikhail didn't get out of bed. Greta licked his hand, whimpered, and looked into his eyes, but he didn't move. She ran outside, barking desperately, trying to get someone's attention. An ambulance came, but they took Mikhail away without explaining anything. Greta was left alone, sitting by the gate, waiting for him to come back. Day turned into night, but he never returned. A few days later, distant relatives came to the house. These people, who had been strangers to Mikhail in life, barged into the house, took everything valuable, and coldly decided Greta's fate. "The dog? Let her fend for herself. We don't have time for her," one of the women said dismissively. That evening, Greta was thrown out of the gate, the door slammed shut in front of her face. She waited outside the house, staring at the windows, but no one came. Soon after, the new owner arrived and chased her away for good. Greta began wandering the streets. She ran up to passers-by, looked into their eyes, hoping to find Mikhail, but they shooed her away like a stray. Her world had become cold and cruel. One day, a car hit her, and limping, she made her way to an abandoned bridge. There, amidst the dampness and cold, Greta curled up into a ball, trembling from pain and hunger. She stared at the gray sky, remembering the warm home and Mikhail's kind hand. Greta closed her eyes, whimpered softly, and, too weak to continue, thought her time had come. Under the bridge it was dark and damp. The water below flowed lazily, producing a muffled sound that only deepened the silence of the surrounding emptiness. Greta lay on the hard ground, curled into a tight ball. The cold seeped through her fur, biting at her skin, while the wind whipped through the cracks, lashing at her sides and making her shiver. A faint mist escaped her breath, but even that disappeared into the icy air, as if the world was rejecting her warmth. Her paws trembled with exhaustion and pain. The one injured by the car barely moved anymore. Each time she tried to stand, a sharp pain shot through her entire body. Her stomach was empty. She hadn't eaten in days. Greta sniffed the ground but found only bits of dirt and rotting leaves. Occasionally she managed to scavenge a crust of bread or scraps from a trash bin, but now even those were gone. Her strength was fading, and the hunger gnawed not only at her body but also at her soul. She lifted her head and gazed at the gray sky, partially visible beneath the arch of the bridge. Large snowflakes began to fall, but instead of bringing beauty, they brought more pain, melting on her warm nose and landing on her wounded paws. In the distance, the sound of cars echoed faintly, but Greta didn't move. She knew that beyond the bridge was danger, people who might hit her, yell at her, or throw stones. Her trust in the world had vanished, leaving only emptiness and fear. Yet that emptiness was filled with longing. Over and over the image of Mikhail came to her mind. She saw his face, wrinkled but kind, smiling as he patted her gently between the ears. She remembered how he prepared warm food for her in the kitchen, whispering soft, comforting words. She remembered their walks through the forest, how he told her stories, laughed, and how she would listen, his voice meaning everything to her. Now, that voice existed only in her mind. She tried to imagine him near her. She thought that if she concentrated hard enough, she might hear his footsteps, catch his scent. But reality crashed down again, reminding her that he was gone and wouldn't return. Greta whimpered softly as if calling out to him, hoping he might hear her and come back. But the bridge was empty. Each new day under the bridge began the same way. She opened her eyes, hoping this was all just a nightmare that would end. But instead of the warm home and Mikhail's voice, she was met with cold ground, bitter wind, and loneliness. Sometimes she would fall asleep and dream of Mikhail reaching out to her, of their walks in the forest. In those dreams, she was happy again. But waking up was torment. Her heart ached, and she whimpered quietly, trying not to draw attention to herself. The world felt alien to her. Every sound, a rustling leaf, the hum of a car, distant footsteps, made her tense up. She tried to retreat deeper into the shadows of the bridge, hoping to stay unseen. People no longer seemed kind. She remembered the ones who had chased her away, yelled at her, or thrown stones. None of them reminded her of Mikhail. And yet, despite the fear and pain, Greta would sometimes lift her head when she heard footsteps. Her eyes would fill with faint hope. Maybe it's him, she thought. Each time she waited to see his familiar figure, to hear his gentle voice, to feel his hand warming her again. But each time, it was someone else. Passers-by hurried along, not noticing her, as if she were just another part of the cold landscape. The flashes of memories became her only comfort, but even they were starting to fade with each passing day. She was terrified that one day she would forget his face, his voice, his warmth. The thought frightened her more than the cold. Morning under the bridge began with an icy wind that tore through the shelter, making Greta shiver. Her body was weak, her paws trembled, and the pain in her injured hind leg had turned into a constant, dull ache. Hunger had tormented her for days. Her stomach felt like it had shriveled into a tight knot, and the weakness made every movement difficult. But instinct forced her to rise and keep moving. She knew that if she stopped, she wouldn't survive the winter. Slowly, with great effort, she crawled out from under the bridge. The wind hit her face, carrying tiny snowflakes that stung like needles. Greta headed toward the nearest trash bins. Her hope was faint, but it was the only chance to find anything to eat. Each step was a struggle. The pain in her leg grew sharper, and the cold made it hard to focus. When she reached the bins, she was met with a new enemy. A large, mangy dog was prowling nearby, sniffing around for scraps. He lifted his head and noticed Greta, immediately baring his teeth. She froze, tensing up, trying to show that she didn't want to fight. But hunger was stronger than fear. Taking a cautious step forward, she lowered her head, showing submission. The other dog, however, lunged at her with a loud snarl. Greta, summoning her last reserves of strength, leapt to the side, but the pain in her injured leg nearly caused her to collapse. She had no choice but to run, limping until the growling faded in the distance. Reaching a quiet alley, she collapsed onto the ground, panting heavily. Her heart pounded, and her leg throbbed with pain. Greta licked at the open wound, but the blood continued to seep. Her vision blurred, and for a moment, she thought it was all over. But once again, she forced herself to get up. Her instincts wouldn't let her give in. Every attempt to find food ended in failure. The trash bins were either empty or had been scavenged before her. Sometimes she approached people leaving stores with bags of groceries. She looked up at them with pleading, hungry eyes, but they almost always chased her away. Once, a woman noticed her, screamed, and threw a rock at her. The rock struck her side, and the pain forced Greta to retreat. She couldn't understand why the world had become so cruel. Once, people like Mikhail had been kind to her, but now they were nothing but a source of danger. At night, the cold grew worse, and Greta searched for shelter. Her paws barely carried her, her eyes drooped with exhaustion, but she couldn't stop. At the edge of a forest, she found a hollow beneath the roots of a large tree. The spot seemed safe enough. She crawled inside, curling into a ball. Snow still crept into the hollow, but at least the biting wind couldn't reach her here. As she closed her eyes, she saw Mikhail again. He reached out to her, stroking the space between her ears, speaking to her in a soft, loving voice. In her dreams, she felt warmth and care once more, but waking up was brutal. Reality offered no comfort. Her body grew weaker with each passing day. Her injured leg barely moved, and the hunger gnawed at her relentlessly. Greta understood that her strength was fading. Each new day felt like an unbearable test, but she refused to give up. Even when pain, cold, and exhaustion pushed her to the brink, her instincts kept driving her forward. She fought on because, deep in her heart, a tiny spark of hope still flickered. A hope that somewhere, beyond the edges of this cruel world, there was still warmth. The warmth she had lost. Snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, covering the ground in a cold white blanket. Under the bridge, it was slightly warmer, but the wind still found its way through, stealing what little comfort the shelter provided. Greta lay trembling, her entire body shaking, when suddenly she heard footsteps. They were getting closer, and her heart tightened. Someone was coming toward the bridge. She froze, pressing herself against the ground, trying to make herself invisible. The footsteps stopped, and a man's voice broke the silence. It was quiet, with a hint of surprise. "Who's there?" Greta lifted her head slightly. In the dim light, she saw him, a tall man wearing a warm jacket and sturdy boots. His face looked concerned but not threatening. In his hands, he held something that looked like a bag. Greta tensed, her eyes darting between his face and the bag. She took a step back, barely managing to keep her balance on her injured leg. The man slowly knelt, placing the bag on the ground. "Hey, girl, it's okay. Don't be afraid," he said softly, stretching out his hand toward her. Greta whimpered in fear. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she was too weak. She tried to make a sudden dash to the side, but the pain in her leg stopped her. Limping, she tried to put more distance between herself and the man, but he didn't move. He just waited. "You're shaking, poor thing," he whispered. The man opened the bag and pulled something out. The smell of food made Greta freeze. It was a piece of meat, warm and fresh. Her empty stomach reacted instantly, and she took a couple of hesitant steps forward, only to retreat again, as if frightened by her own courage. The man placed the meat on the ground and stepped back a few paces before crouching again, watching her. His movements were slow and deliberate, as if he didn't want to scare her. "It's for you. Go ahead. Eat," he said gently. Greta stood frozen, her eyes flicking between the food and the man. She could smell the meat, but her fear held her back. Memories of harsh shouts, kicks, and stones flashed through her mind. Her body remembered the pain, and trusting anyone felt impossible. But the hunger was too much to bear. She took a cautious step forward, then another. The man remained still, only watching. "It's okay, girl. I won't hurt you," he murmured, almost in a whisper. At last, Greta reached the meat. She carefully grabbed it, ready to bolt at any moment, but her legs refused to obey. She collapsed, her nose pressed into the snow, but she continued chewing. The man didn't approach her. He just sat there, watching with a look of quiet compassion. When the meat was gone, Greta raised her head and looked at him. Her eyes, filled with fear and sorrow, met his gaze. For a moment, she thought she saw something familiar. His eyes were warm, just like Mikhail's. She swallowed hard, but fear overtook her again, and she began to back away. The man noticed her unease. "It's okay, I won't hurt you. You need a home, don't you?" he said, softly, his voice so gentle that Greta froze. She didn't know what to do. Her body was ready to run, but something inside her pulled her toward this man. She wanted to feel a warm hand again, to hear a voice that didn't yell but comforted. She battled with herself, move closer, or flee into the darkness. The man slowly extended his hand. "Come on, let me help you." Greta stood there, trembling from the cold and fear. Inside her, a conflict raged. Mistrust screamed at her to run, but a faint spark of hope urged her to stay. She took a tiny step forward, stopped, and looked at him again. He didn't move. He was just waiting. Her body made the decision for her. Slowly, she stepped closer, lowering her head, and allowed him to touch her. His warm hand gently rested on her head, and she closed her eyes. For that moment, her fears receded. She felt warmth she hadn't known in days, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't want to run. The man carefully picked Greta up in his arms. She was light, a shadow of the dog she used to be. Her body shook, from the cold, from weakness, and from fear. She struggled briefly, but she had no strength left. His warm jacket smelled of something calm and safe, and that strange sensation lulled her fears, if only for a moment. He carried her to his small home, warmed by an old wood stove. Greta felt the heat the moment they stepped inside. It was so unfamiliar that she froze, her eyes wide. The man set her down gently on a soft blanket near the stove, placing a bowl of warm water and a piece of bread beside her. "Eat, girl," he said kindly, stepping back a few paces so as not to frighten her. Greta cautiously looked around. She was still afraid it might be a trap, but hunger won out. Slowly, with suspicion, she began to drink the water, then carefully bit into the bread. Every crumb filled her empty stomach, but the fears in her mind lingered. What if he throws me out once I've eaten? What if he hurts me? For now, though, she was warm, and her stomach no longer felt like it was twisting in pain. And as she lay on the soft blanket, she allowed herself to hope, just a little, that this man might be different. The man sat nearby, watching her. His calm voice cut through the noise of her thoughts. "It's going to be okay. You're not alone anymore." When the food was gone, Greta cautiously lay down on the blanket. Her eyes never left the man, tracking his every movement. He gave her space, not coming too close. He understood that trust wouldn't be built in a single night. The night brought Greta a strange sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. But sleep wouldn't come. Her eyes wandered around the room and every shadow made her tense. She was terrified that the warmth and safety would disappear as suddenly as they had come. Her eyelids grew heavy, but she forced herself to stay awake. She was convinced that if she fell asleep, she would wake up back under the bridge. The man noticed her unease. "It's all right, girl. You're safe now," he said, stroking her head. His hand was warm, and, for the first time, Greta allowed herself to relax a little. She curled up on the blanket, and despite her lingering fear, she drifted into a deep sleep. The days that followed brought new challenges for Greta. The man, whom she now knew as Ivan, cared for her. He brought her warm meals, cleaned her wound, and spoke to her in a quiet, soothing voice. Every movement he made was filled with patience. He never rushed her or forced her to come closer if she wasn't ready. Greta began to slowly adjust to his presence. She no longer curled into a tight ball when he entered the room, and she stopped running away when he extended his hand toward her. But the fear lingered. Every loud noise, every sudden movement reminded her of the pain she had endured. One day, Ivan took her on a short walk by the river. Greta walked cautiously, her eyes darting around, but she felt a bit more confident with him by her side. He spoke to her, sharing his thoughts as if she could understand him. "You're strong, girl. We'll find you a real home, a place where you'll be loved." Somehow those words seemed to reach her. Her gaze softened, and she no longer turned away when he looked her in the eyes. A few weeks later, Ivan took her to a local shelter. It wasn't an easy decision for either of them. Greta nervously scanned her surroundings, unsettled by the unfamiliar people and dogs. But Ivan didn't leave her side right away. He spoke with the shelter volunteers, explaining her story and asking them to give her extra care. He made sure they understood that she was still learning to trust. When it was time to say goodbye, Ivan knelt down beside her. "You're going to be okay, Greta. I promise they'll find you a family who will give you the love you deserve." Her eyes were filled with sadness, but she didn't pull away as he gently stroked the space between her ears. His warmth had been her first step toward a new life, and she wouldn't forget it. Ivan walked away, glancing back one last time. Greta sat quietly in her new shelter, watching him leave. For the first time in a long time, she felt that her struggle had been worth it. Ahead of her was a new chance, a chance at a life where she could finally find the love and safety she had lost. At the shelter, everything felt unfamiliar to Greta, but it was warm and comfortable. She was placed in a clean, cozy kennel with a soft blanket to lie on, and her food bowl was never empty. The people there were kind. They petted her, spoke gentle words, and brought her treats every day. The volunteers, having heard her story from Ivan, made every effort to surround her with care. Greta was still cautious. Sometimes she shrank into a corner when someone approached too quickly, but she was starting to believe that things were different now. Her eyes no longer brimmed with fear, and her coat, though still dull and ruffled, was beginning to regain its shine. Her injured leg was healing, and she was able to go on short walks with the volunteers. Every morning, Greta would look toward the shelter door. She was waiting for someone who would become her new owner. Her gaze was filled with hope, but without urgency. No one rushed her here. They loved her for who she was, scars and all, both the ones on her body and the ones on her soul. The volunteers told visitors that Greta was special. They explained how smart and strong she was, but also how her spirit had been wounded. She needed someone who could offer her love and patience. Everyone at the shelter believed that person would come. Greta had earned her second chance at life. For now, she waited. She waited with quiet confidence that one day she would have a home again, a place where someone would once more call her their faithful companion. And as she lay on her blanket, she would sometimes close her eyes and imagine hearing Mikhail's warm voice again. But now, it wasn't a voice filled with the pain of loss. Instead, it was filled with hope. Hope that she would find a new family, one that would never betray her.